February 25th, 1916. A small group of German soldiers crept toward the massive stone walls of Fort Douaumont, the strongest fortress in the entire Verdun defensive system. They expected a bloodbath. Hundreds of French defenders with machine guns and artillery. Instead, they found a handful of confused French gunners who surrendered without firing a single shot. The Germans had just captured the linchpin of France's defences, almost by accident. Within hours, German newspapers were screaming victory. The fall of Verdun seemed inevitable. But something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of days, the battle would rage for 300 days. Instead of a swift victory, it would consume over 700,000 men. Instead of winning the war for Germany, it would help lose it. This is the story of Verdun, Germany's fatal gamble. And the question that still haunts historians: what was Chief of the General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn actually trying to achieve? Even after the battle ended, nobody really knew. His own commanders didn't understand the strategy. After the war, Falkenhayn claimed he'd planned everything perfectly, but most historians today think he was lying. Here's what we know for certain. In December 1915, Germany faced an impossible choice. If they attacked, French trenches might stop them. If they waited, the Entente's growing strength would overwhelm them. Falkenhayn chose Verdun as the answer. The most fortified sector of the French line. A symbol of French pride. A salient that could be attacked from 3 sides. By February, Germany was committed. 1,250 guns. 2 million shells. The greatest artillery barrage the world had ever seen. The French had made their own fatal assumption. Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre believed Verdun's famous forts were no longer important. Modern artillery had already smashed supposedly impregnable Belgian and Russian fortresses. So Joffre stripped Verdun of artillery and troops, even from Fort Douaumont itself. In military terms, French High Command believed Verdun didn't have to be held at all costs. If necessary, it could be abandoned. That calculation reversed within 72 hours of the first shells falling. Once the battle began on February 21st, both nations became prisoners of Verdun. France could not abandon it without catastrophic damage to morale. Germany could not withdraw without admitting failure. So both sides fed more men into the furnace. 300 days of continuous battle. 377,000 French casualties. 335,000 German. Over 700,000 men killed, wounded, or driven mad. And for what? By December, the front lines had barely moved. Verdun still stood. Falkenhayn was gone, removed in disgrace. France had held, but at a cost that would scar an entire generation. 3 questions haunt this battle. What was Falkenhayn actually trying to achieve? Why did Germany lose, despite overwhelming firepower and dramatic early success? And why did this battle become the symbol of the First World War itself? This is how Germany's master plan became a 300-day bloodbath that neither side could escape. The story begins 2 months earlier, when Erich von Falkenhayn tried to solve an impossible riddle. December 1915. The German General Staff headquarters in the town of Pless. Chief of the General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn stood over maps of the Western Front and faced a problem with no good solution. On paper, 1915 had been a successful year for the Central Powers. That summer, German and Austro-Hungarian forces had driven the Russian army back hundreds of kilometers in the great offensive known as the Gorlice-Tarnów breakthrough. In the fall, Bulgaria had joined the Central Powers and helped crush Serbia once and for all. But Falkenhayn knew these victories masked a deeper problem. The Entente, France, Britain, Russia, and their allies, still had more men, more factories, more resources. And most dangerous of all, they had time. Every month that passed, Britain's new armies grew larger and better trained. French war production accelerated. American loans kept the Entente economies running. Meanwhile, Germany was slowly suffocating under the British naval blockade. Food shortages were beginning. Raw materials were becoming scarce. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and simple. If the war continued for another year, or 2, or 3, Germany would lose. Something had to be done in 1916. But what? The German General Staff debated their options through December. They could launch another offensive in Russia. But the Russians had proven they would simply retreat rather than accept decisive battle. You could push them back, take territory, capture prisoners, but you couldn't knock them out of the war. They could attack at Salonika in the Balkans, where French and British forces had landed to support their Serbian allies. But this was clearly a secondary theatre. Victory there wouldn't decide the war. No, the only potentially decisive front was in the West. France and Britain were Germany's most dangerous enemies. If either could be knocked out of the war, the entire strategic situation would transform. Britain was nearly impossible to attack directly, protected by the Royal Navy and the English Channel. That left France. But here, Falkenhayn faced the fundamental problem of trench warfare. Throughout 1915, the French had launched massive offensives in Champagne and Artois and gotten nowhere. French infantry had attacked German trenches again and again, supported by hundreds of guns. They had gained a few kilometers at most, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. German trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns had stopped them cold. But if French offensives couldn't break through German defences, why would a German offensive break through French defences? The trenches worked both ways. Defence was simply too strong. Falkenhayn himself believed that breakthrough in trench warfare was impossible with current technology and tactics. You could push the enemy back a few kilometers at enormous cost, but you couldn't rupture the front, pour through cavalry and mobile forces, and win a war of maneuver like in 1870. Those days were gone. So, if Germany attacked in the West, they would probably get bogged down in the same grinding attrition that had characterized every offensive so far. Gain a few kilometers. Lose tens of thousands of men. Achieve nothing decisive. But if Germany didn't attack, if they just waited and defended, the Entente's advantages in men and resources would eventually tell. Britain would field a massive new army in 1916. France would recover from 1915's losses. Russia would rebuild. And the blockade would slowly strangle Germany's economy. Time was not on Germany's side. This was the impossible riddle Falkenhayn had to solve. Attack and probably fail to break through, wasting precious reserves in futile offensives. Or wait and let the Entente's growing strength overwhelm Germany in 18 months or 2 years. There had to be another option. A third way. Some way to damage France so severely that either the French would seek peace or Britain would have to carry the burden of the war alone in the West, or the whole strategic calculus would shift in Germany's favour. By late December, Falkenhayn had made his choice. He would attack the French at Verdun. Verdun. The name carried weight in both France and Germany. It was the most fortified sector of the entire French line. A ring of massive concrete and stone forts surrounded the city, connected by underground tunnels and protected by interlocking fields of fire. Before the war, French military theorists had considered Verdun essentially impregnable. The fortified region had been designed to anchor France's entire defensive system on the northeastern frontier. But Verdun was also vulnerable in a specific way. It formed a salient, a bulge in the French line that jutted toward German positions. German forces held territory north, east, and partly west of the city. They could attack it from 3 sides. From a tactical standpoint, salients were dangerous. Expensive to defend. Exposed to artillery fire from multiple directions. Difficult to supply. If Germany could eliminate the Verdun salient, they would deal France a major blow. Shorten their own defensive line. Remove a potential jumping-off point for French offensives. Secure the vital railway junction and German city of Metz. More than that, Verdun carried enormous symbolic weight. It had been a fortress city since Roman times. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Verdun had been one of the last French strongholds to fall. To lose Verdun would be a psychological catastrophe for France. So far, this all made military sense. Attack a fortified, salient with symbolic value, eliminate it, damage French morale, improve Germany's strategic position. But here the plan becomes murky, and historians have been arguing about Falkenhayn's true intentions ever since. For decades after the war, most historians accepted Falkenhayn's own account in his published memoirs. In those memoirs, Falkenhayn claimed his intention had never been to actually take Verdun through a traditional breakthrough. Instead, he said he had planned from the beginning to bleed France white through attrition. According to this account, Falkenhayn expected the French would defend Verdun at all costs because of its symbolic importance. So he would attack it with overwhelming artillery but minimal infantry, forcing France to feed divisions into a killing ground where German guns would systematically destroy them. France would lose men faster than Germany. Eventually, French casualties would become unsustainable. The French army would break. France would seek peace. It was elegant in theory. a strategy of attrition that exploited French psychology and turned their determination into a weakness. But most historians today believe Falkenhayn was lying in his memoirs. The evidence suggests his original plan was more conventional. Crown Prince Wilhelm's Fifth Army would launch a massive artillery-supported offensive to seize the Meuse Heights, the high ground dominating Verdun from the east. If successful, German artillery positioned on those heights could rain destruction on the city and any French forces trying to hold it. In Falkenhayn's own words to Prussian War Minister Adolf Wild von Hohenborn, "Not even a mouse would be able to survive under that fire." With the heights secured, Verdun itself might fall quickly. Or France might recognize it was untenable and abandon it. Either way, major psychological blow to France, improved German strategic position, perhaps even the beginning of French collapse. According to this interpretation, Falkenhayn only switched to claiming an attrition strategy after the initial plan failed. When the offensive bogged down and casualties mounted on both sides, he needed a way to claim success. So he invented the story that bleeding France white had been his intention all along. The truth is probably that Falkenhayn himself didn't have a clear strategic endgame beyond taking the Meuse Heights. He hoped, expected, even, that seizing Verdun or inflicting massive French casualties would somehow shift the strategic balance. Maybe France would collapse. Maybe they would seek peace. Maybe Britain would have to shoulder more of the burden in the West. But there was no detailed plan for what happened after Verdun fell or after France suffered heavy losses. Just hope that pressure would produce results. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, one of Germany's most capable field commanders, captured this uncertainty in his diary. Writing in early 1916, he expressed confusion about Falkenhayn's strategy. Ruprecht wrote that Falkenhayn wasn't clear what he actually wanted. That Falkenhayn seemed to be waiting for a stroke of good luck that would bring an advantageous solution. Falkenhayn wanted a decision in spring 1916, Ruprecht noted. But he also explained that breakthrough was impossible. So, how could they force a shift from trench warfare to mobile warfare? How could they achieve decision? Ruprecht didn't know. And apparently, neither did Falkenhayn. Through January 1916, Germany prepared for what they called Operation Judgment, Unternehmengericht. The offensive would begin on February 12th. Fifth Army, commanded by Crown Prince Wilhelm, the Kaiser's son, would execute the attack. But even as preparations accelerated, a critical disagreement emerged between Falkenhayn and Fifth Army Command. Fifth Army Chief of Staff, General Constantin Schmidt von Knobelsdorff, and other officers argued that Germany must attack on both banks of the Meuse River. Their reasoning was tactically sound. If German forces attacked only on the east bank, the right bank, they would be exposed to devastating flanking fire from French artillery positioned on the high ground on the west bank, the left bank. French guns on the western heights would be able to hit German infantry, advancing on the eastern side from the flank. Any German penetration would create an even more vulnerable salient. To succeed, Germany needed to secure both banks simultaneously. Eliminate the French artillery on the west, then push forward on the east toward the Meuse Heights and Verdun itself. It would require more troops, more guns, more resources. But it was the only way to avoid a tactical nightmare. Falkenhayn overruled them. The attack would proceed on the east bank only, at least initially. His reasoning isn't entirely clear from the historical record. Perhaps he wanted to conserve infantry reserves for later phases of the operation or for use elsewhere. Perhaps he believed overwhelming artillery superiority on the east bank would be sufficient. Whatever his reasons, this decision would have catastrophic consequences. The operational plan itself relied on a new approach. Falkenhayn wanted to use as little infantry as possible, preserving his precious reserves. Instead, the attack would depend on overwhelming, systematic artillery firepower. Through January, German forces secretly assembled the largest concentration of artillery yet seen on the Western Front. 1,250 guns of all calibers. There were light 77mm field guns for suppressing French infantry, heavy 105 and 150mm howitzers for destroying trenches and strongpoints, super heavy 210 and 305mm siege mortars for smashing the concrete forts. Even a handful of massive 420mm Big Bertha howitzers, the same weapons that had demolished Belgian forts in 1914. This gave Germany an artillery superiority of roughly 2-1 over French forces in the Verdun sector. The plan was to pulverize French positions systematically, destroy trenches, cut barbed wire, bury defenders under high explosive and shrapnel, use gas shells to suppress French artillery batteries. Then, German infantry would advance cautiously behind the barrage, infiltrating French lines, bypassing strongpoints, exploiting gaps in the shattered defences. It was an early version of the stormtrooper tactics that would later become standard German doctrine. The Germans had stockpiled 2 million shells for the first week of bombardment alone. An incomprehensible amount of firepower about to be unleashed on a relatively small section of the French line. To ensure surprise and prevent French reinforcement, Germany also achieved air superiority over Verdun. 270 German aircraft aggressively patrolled the skies above the fortress. They had two missions. First, prevent the 70 available French aircraft from conducting reconnaissance flights that might reveal the German build-up. Second, shoot down any French observation balloons directing artillery fire. By mid-January, German pilots had achieved near total dominance of the airspace over Verdun. French commanders had only a vague sense of what was coming. The forces assembled for the attack reflected Germany's numerical advantage in this sector. About 60,000 German assault troops in the first waves. Facing them, approximately 30,000 French soldiers from weak, understrength divisions. Everything was in place for Operation Judgment to begin on February 12th. Then winter weather intervened. Heavy snow and fog blanketed the region. Artillery observation would be impossible. Infantry couldn't advance across muddy, shell-torn ground in these conditions. The offensive was postponed day after day as Falkenhayn waited for clear skies. The delay had an unintended consequence. On the night of February 13th, several Alsatian soldiers, Frenchmen by ethnicity but conscripted into the German army, deserted to French lines. They revealed the coming attack. French commanders now had a few precious days to prepare. They rushed forward reinforcements, stockpiled ammunition, improved trenches where they could. But the preparations were hasty and incomplete. There simply wasn't enough time to fundamentally strengthen Verdun's defences. Finally, on February 21st, the weather cleared. Falkenhayn gave the order. Operation Judgment would begin at 7:15 in the morning. That is less than #3. 0# is greater than. While Germany prepared the largest offensive of the war, French General Headquarters had made a decision that would have disastrous consequences. Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre, the stolid, methodical general who had saved France at the Battle of the Marne in 1914, believed that Verdun's famous ring of forts was no longer critically important. His reasoning came from hard lessons learned earlier in the war. In August 1914, massive German siege artillery had demolished the supposedly impregnable Belgian forts around Liège and Namur in a matter of days. Later, similar German guns smashed Russian fortifications on the Eastern Front. In 1915, Austro-Hungarian heavy artillery had destroyed Italian mountain forts. The lesson seemed clear. Fixed fortifications, no matter how thick their concrete and steel, could not withstand modern heavy artillery. The age of forts was over. This was a reasonable conclusion based on recent experience. But Joffre took it too far. Through late 1915, French High Command systematically stripped the Verdun fortified region of artillery and garrison troops. Dozens of heavy guns were removed from the forts and sent to other sectors where they could support offensive operations. Infantry garrisons were reduced to skeleton crews or removed entirely. Ammunition stocks were drawn down. Even the two most important forts in the entire defensive system, Douaumont and Vaux, were left nearly undefended. Fort Douaumont was particularly critical. It sat on the highest ground in the region. Its guns could cover the entire battlefield. Before the war, it had held a garrison of over 500 men and dozens of artillery pieces. By February 1916, Douaumont's garrison had been reduced to fewer than 60 men, mostly elderly territorial reservists, serving as maintenance and guard personnel. Most of its guns had been removed. The fort that was supposed to be the linchpin of Verdun's defences was essentially abandoned. One man saw the danger clearly. Colonel Émile Driant commanded a battalion of chasseurs, light infantry, in the Bois des Cours, a wooded area north of Verdun that would be directly in the path of any German offensive. Driant was not only a professional soldier, but also a member of the French Chamber of Deputies, Parliament. He had political connections and wasn't afraid to use them. Through late 1915 and early 1916, Driant sent increasingly urgent warnings to Paris. He reported that German preparations were clearly visible, that defences around Verdun were inadequate, that his sector, in particular, was vulnerable. He argued vehemently for better defences, more troops, more artillery. His warnings were ignored. The truth was that French High Command's logic about Verdun was coldly rational, from a purely military standpoint. Verdun didn't actually have to be held at all costs. In operational terms, it was just one sector among many. Yes, it had symbolic importance. Yes, losing it would be embarrassing. But militarily, the forts could anchor the defensive line as long as that made sense. If the Germans attacked with overwhelming force and the position became untenable, French forces could withdraw to a more defensible line farther back. Preserve the army. Trade space for time. Don't waste men defending fortifications that modern artillery could destroy anyway. It was the same logic that had led Russia to retreat hundreds of kilometers rather than defend untenable positions in 1915. Operationally sound. Strategically flexible. But it ignored something that cold military logic often misses: psychology. Once the German attack began, once Verdun came under threat, the entire calculation would change. France would discover that some positions cannot be abandoned without catastrophic damage to national morale. And Germany would discover that positions you cannot afford to lose become traps you cannot escape. Both nations were about to make decisions that would lock them into a battle neither had really planned for. A battle that would consume them both. February 21st, 1916. After 9 days of weather delays, the skies above Verdun finally cleared. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, 1,250 German guns opened fire simultaneously. Is less than #3. 0 hash is greater than. The sound was unlike anything the world had ever heard. Soldiers over 100 kilometers away reported hearing the distant rumble. In the fortress city itself, the bombardment was apocalyptic. High explosive shells crashed into French trenches, collapsing dugouts and burying men alive. Shrapnel rounds burst overhead, spraying steel fragments across the landscape. Gas shells released clouds of toxic chlorine and phosgene that seeped into shelters and suffocated anyone without a mask. The German artillery plan was methodical and systematic. First, batteries concentrated on French artillery positions, trying to destroy French guns before they could respond. Then they shifted to French frontline trenches. Then communication trenches. Then supply depots and headquarters positions in the rear. German forward observers in aircraft and observation balloons directed the fire with ruthless efficiency. When French infantry tried to move, shells found them. When French artillery tried to fire back, German batteries smothered them with counter-battery fire. The bombardment continued for 9 hours without pause. By 4 in the afternoon, large sections of the French front line had simply ceased to exist. Trenches were obliterated. Barbed wire was cut or blown away. Communication lines were severed. Many French units had no contact with higher command and no idea what was happening beyond their immediate position. Then, at 4:15, the German infantry advanced. But they didn't advance the way infantry had attacked throughout 1915, in massed waves, charging toward enemy trenches. Instead, German assault troops moved forward cautiously in small groups. They used cover. They infiltrated between French strongpoints. When they encountered resistance, they didn't try to overpower it. They called in artillery and went around. These were early stormtrooper tactics. The beginning of a tactical revolution that would eventually transform German operations. Not every French position had been destroyed by the bombardment. Some units, dug deep into the frozen earth or protected by concrete bunkers, had survived. One of these was Colonel Émile Driant's battalion in the Bois des Cours. Driant, The man whose warnings about Verdun's weakness had been ignored now found himself commanding one of the forward positions directly in the path of the German assault. His chasseurs fought with desperate determination. They had good defensive positions in the woods. They knew the terrain, and they understood that if they broke, there was very little behind them to stop the Germans. The fighting in the Bois des Cours was savage and close range. German infantry worked their way through the shattered woods, clearing French positions with grenades and flamethrowers. French chasseurs counterattacked again and again, trying to push the Germans back. Driant's battalion held throughout February 21st, buying precious time for French reinforcements to move up. But the cost was terrible. Dr. Louis Maufray, a French physician who had witnessed the refugees fleeing Verdun days earlier, was now closer to the front as the battle began. He later wrote about the human cost of the bombardment, about soldiers brought to his aid station with wounds unlike anything he'd seen before. Men buried by collapsing trenches. Men driven mad by the concussion of heavy shells. Men with lungs seared by poison gas. The scale of the German artillery superiority was becoming clear. This wasn't just another offensive. This was industrialized destruction. By nightfall on February 21st, German forces had made limited but real progress. They had penetrated the French first line in several places. They held positions on the edges of the Bois des Cours, and they had barely committed their reserves. At German Fifth Army headquarters, Crown Prince Wilhelm and General Schmidt von Knobelsdorff were cautiously optimistic. The attack was proceeding according to plan. At German General Staff headquarters in Pless, Falkenhayn was more than optimistic. He was confident. He told his staff, "Sehen Sie, mit dem Angriff habe ich mal wieder das Richtige getroffen." See, with the attack I was right again. February 22nd dawned cold and clear. The German bombardment resumed at dawn and continued with the same methodical intensity. Another 2 million shells had been stockpiled. The guns would not go silent. German infantry renewed their advance, pushing deeper into French positions. The combination of overwhelming artillery and infiltration tactics was proving devastatingly effective. In the Bois des Cours, Colonel Driant's battalion was being ground down. His chasseurs had held all through the 21st and into the morning of the 22nd. But German forces were now working around both flanks of the wood, threatening to cut off the defenders. Driant ordered a fighting withdrawal. His men would fall back to secondary positions, delaying the Germans at every step. He was leading a group of chasseurs through the shattered trees when German machine gun fire ripped through the group. Colonel Emile Driant, the man who had warned Paris that Verdun was vulnerable, the politician soldier who had fought to strengthen the defences, was killed instantly. By the end of February 22nd, the Bois des Cours had fallen. German forces were now advancing on a broad front, pushing back the outnumbered and disorganized French defenders. In some sectors, they had advanced 3 or 4 kilometers. At German headquarters, Falkenhayn's confidence was growing. The French were falling back. Casualties seemed to be heavy. The offensive was working. German newspapers began preparing to announce a great victory. February 21st through 25th would prove to be the most critical 5 days of the entire battle. German forces continued their methodical advance. The artillery would pulverize a section of French line. Infantry would infiltrate forward. When French defenders counterattacked or tried to establish new positions, the artillery would destroy them. The combination was proving almost unstoppable. French defences in the Verdun sector had been weak to begin with, thanks to Joffre's decision to strip the fortified region of guns and troops. Now they were collapsing under the German onslaught. French communication systems had been cut by the bombardment. Many French commanders had no idea where their own units were, let alone what the Germans were doing. Orders took hours to arrive, if they arrived at all. French reserves trying to move forward were caught by German artillery fire. The roads leading to Verdun were under constant bombardment. Moving during daylight was suicidal. By February 23rd, German forces had advanced up to 6 kilometers in some sectors. They had overrun French first-line trenches, second-line trenches, and were pushing toward the main line of resistance. More critically, they were approaching the ring of forts that supposedly made Verdun impregnable. On the morning of February 24th, German artillery shifted focus. Now the heavy guns, the 210mm and 305mm siege mortars, began systematically pounding the forts themselves. The concrete and steel fortifications that French military theorists had once considered the pride of their defensive system were about to face their ultimate test. And in the most important fort of all, Fort Douaumont, something had gone catastrophically wrong with French command and control. Fort Douaumont sat on the highest point of the Meuse Heights. Its guns commanded the entire battlefield. Before the war, it had been considered virtually impregnable, protected by thick concrete walls, steel turrets, and deep underground galleries. A determined garrison with adequate supplies could theoretically hold Fort Douaumont for weeks or even months against any assault. But on February 25, 1916, Fort Douaumont's garrison consisted of fewer than 60 men. Most were elderly territorial reservists, older soldiers from reserve units who served as maintenance personnel and guards. The fort's artillery had been removed months earlier. No infantry combat units were stationed there. Worse, there seems to have been confusion about who was actually responsible for defending Douaumont. The fort technically fell between different French command jurisdictions. In the chaos of the German offensive, no one had thought to properly garrison it. On the afternoon of February 25th, a small German patrol, perhaps a dozen men from the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, approached Fort Douaumont cautiously. They expected fierce resistance. This was the strongest fort in the entire Verdun system. Surely it would be heavily defended. Instead, they found the main gates open. The German patrol entered the fort carefully, weapons ready, expecting an ambush at every turn. They made their way through the dark, empty corridors. Eventually, they found a small group of French gunners, perhaps 20 or 30 men, who seemed confused about what was happening. The French surrendered without firing a shot. Within an hour, more German troops had arrived. Fort Douaumont, the linchpin of Verdun's defences, the fortress that was supposed to anchor the entire French line, was in German hands. The fall of Fort Douaumont was a propaganda disaster for France and a propaganda triumph for Germany. German newspapers across the Reich trumpeted the victory. Headlines screamed that the supposedly impregnable fortress had fallen to the brave German assault troops. The German public, hungry for good news after a year of bloody stalemate, celebrated. The truth that Douaumont had been essentially undefended and had surrendered without a real fight was conveniently omitted from the German press. At German headquarters, several officers would argue for decades after the war about who had actually captured Fort Douaumont. Multiple units claimed credit. Who had entered first? Who had accepted the surrender? The glory of capturing the great fortress was too valuable to share. The ridiculous nature of these arguments, officers fighting over credit for capturing an abandoned fort, would only become clear much later. By February 28th, 1 week into the offensive, German forces had advanced up to 8 kilometers in some sectors. They held Fort Douaumont. They controlled much of the high ground on the east bank of the Meuse. French defences appeared to be on the verge of collapse. At this moment, this precise window of opportunity, most historians believe Germany could have won the Battle of Verdun. If Falkenhayn had committed more infantry divisions to the initial offensive, if he had been willing to risk more reserves in the first week, German forces almost certainly could have completed the capture of the Meuse heights. The French were disorganized, outnumbered, and reeling. Their defensive system had been shattered. Their reserves hadn't yet arrived in force. One more big push, one more wave of German infantry supported by that overwhelming artillery, and the heights would fall. But Falkenhayn had designed Operation Judgment to use minimal infantry. He wanted to preserve his reserves. He believed artillery alone could do most of the work. So the additional infantry divisions that might have made the difference remained in reserve. And on February 28th, the window of opportunity began to close. Because France had made a decision. In the first days of the offensive, French general headquarters had been caught completely off guard by the scale and intensity of the German attack. Despite Colonel Dryant's warnings, despite reports from Alsatian deserters, French High Command had not believed Germany would launch a major offensive at Verdun. Now they faced a crisis. Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre was at his headquarters at Chantilly when news of the attack arrived. His initial response was relatively calm. Yes, this was a significant German offensive. Yes, French forces were falling back. But militarily, Verdun wasn't actually critical. If the position became untenable, French forces could withdraw to a more defensible line. This was the same cold, rational calculation French High Command had made when they stripped Verdun of troops and artillery. Don't waste men defending positions that aren't operationally necessary. But by February 25th, with Fort Douaumont captured and German newspapers screaming victory, the calculation had changed completely. It was no longer a purely military question. It was psychological. It was political. It was about national will. If France abandoned Verdun now, if they pulled back and let the Germans take the fortress city without a real fight, what message would that send? To the French people? That Germany could break French resistance, that the army couldn't defend France's historic fortresses. To France's allies? That French resolve was weakening. That Germany was winning. To neutral nations watching the war, that the tide was turning against the Entente. Joffre made his decision. Verdun must be held, at all costs. On February 25th, Joffre placed General Henri-Philippe Pétain in command of the defence of Verdun. Pétain, 59 years old, a methodical and defensive-minded commander, was given one mission: stop the Germans. Pétain immediately began organising the defence with the systematic efficiency that would make him famous. He established his headquarters at Souilly, a small town south of Verdun. From there, he could coordinate the entire defensive effort. His first priority was getting reinforcements to the front as quickly as possible. This was more difficult than it sounds. Verdun's position as a salient meant it was poorly connected to the French rear. The main railway line that supplied the fortress had been cut by German artillery. Only one narrow road, running from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, remained open. But Pétain recognized this road was now the lifeline of the entire defense. Without it, Verdun would fall within days. He immediately ordered thousands of trucks to begin shuttling men and supplies up this road. The road would become known as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. By the last days of February, French reinforcements were flooding into Verdun. Fresh divisions, artillery batteries, ammunition, supplies. Everything moving up that single narrow road in an endless stream. The balance of forces was shifting. On February 28th, German forces attacking toward Verdun ran into something they hadn't encountered in the first week: organised, determined resistance from fresh French troops. The German advance slowed, then stopped. At German headquarters, the initial euphoria began to fade. War Minister Adolf Wild von Hohenborn wrote in his diary, "Falkenhayn is very nervous because of the impasse and heavy losses." The offensive had achieved dramatic gains in the first week. Fort Douaumont had fallen. German forces held much of the East Bank high ground. But they hadn't completed the capture of the Meuse Heights. They hadn't reached Verdun itself. And now French resistance was stiffening. The window of opportunity was closing. For the soldiers at the front, the experience of the battle was becoming clear. This would not be a swift offensive ending in days or weeks. This would be a grinding, attritional nightmare. Dr. Louis Malfres experienced this reality firsthand. He was working in an underground aid station near the front when a German heavy shell scored a direct hit on the position above them. He later wrote, "The shock was terrifying. Those who, like me, were sitting were lifted out of their seats. Those who were standing collapsed. I felt a violent blow to my stomach and head. The lights all went out. The door resonated like a struck gong, and, underneath, was engulfed by a cloud of dust and burnt gas that seared our throat and nostrils. No one breathed a word. We heard the big chunks of earth raining down on the shelter above us. And then, after a long minute, the noise slackened. This was what German artillery superiority meant in practice. Not abstract statistics about shells fired, but the actual lived experience of men trying to survive under that bombardment. The German offensive had failed to achieve its initial objectives. But it was far from over. France had committed to defending Verdun at all costs. Germany had invested too much to pull back now. Both sides were locked in. By early March, German Fifth Army Command faced the exact tactical nightmare they had warned Falkenhayn about. German forces held positions on the east bank of the Meuse, including Fort Douaumont and parts of the high ground. But they hadn't captured all the eastern heights. And critically, they had never attacked the west bank. This meant French artillery positioned on the western heights, especially on two hills that would become infamous. Hill 304 and Le Mort-Homme could rain devastating flanking fire on German positions across the river. Every German movement on the east bank was visible to French observers on the west bank. Every German attack was hit by French guns from the flank. Every supply column moving forward was shelled. The Germans were trying to advance while exposed to fire from three sides. It was tactically untenable. General Schmidt von Knobelsdorff, Fifth Army Chief of Staff, had argued in January that both banks needed to be attacked simultaneously. Falkenhayn had overruled him. Now, 5 weeks into the offensive, Schmidt von Knobelsdorff's warnings had proven prophetic. On March 6th, Germany launched a major offensive on the west bank of the Meuse. But the situation was completely different from the initial attack on February 21st. Then, German forces had achieved surprise, faced weak French defences, and had overwhelming artillery superiority in a concentrated sector. Now, the French were prepared. They had reinforced the west bank. They knew an attack was coming, and most critically, they held strong defensive positions on two dominating hills. Hill 304 rose 295 metres above sea level. Le Mort-Homme, Dead Man's Hill, rose to 295 metres. Both offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain. French artillery observers on these heights could direct fire across the entire battlefield. French infantry dug into the slopes could pour rifle and machine gun fire on any German troops trying to advance. The German offensive on March 6th made some initial progress. Artillery pounded French positions. Infantry pushed forward. Some ground was taken. But French resistance was fierce and well organised. This wasn't the near collapse of the first week in February. This was determined defence by fresh troops fighting from prepared positions. The battle for Hill 304 and Le Mort-Homme would rage for weeks. The intensity of the artillery fire on these two hills defied comprehension. German heavy guns pounded the French positions day and night. French artillery fired back at German infantry, trying to advance. The hills were systematically torn apart by high explosive. Trees were reduced to splinters. The earth itself was churned and rechurned by shells. Trenches collapsed and had to be dug again. And again. And again. The landscape was transformed into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters. By the time the battle ended months later, Le Mort-Homme had been physically reduced by the bombardment. Surveys after the war showed the hill was 20 meters lower than before the battle began. 20 meters of earth and rock, simply blown away by artillery fire. But through March and into April, the French held both hills. German attacks gained a few hundred meters here, a trench line there. But they couldn't break through, couldn't take the heights, couldn't eliminate the French artillery that continued to savage their positions on the east bank. The trap was complete. Germany was now committed to attacking on both banks of the Meuse simultaneously. This meant dividing their forces, spreading their artillery, fighting on two fronts. The short, sharp operation to seize the Meuse heights and eliminate the Verdun salient had become something completely different. It had become a grinding, attritional battle of the exact type Falkenhayn had supposedly wanted to avoid. The irony was bitter. French High Command's decision to defend Verdun at all costs was exactly what Falkenhayn would later claim he had wanted all along. According to his post-war memoirs, his plan had always been to bleed France white by forcing them to defend Verdun. And now France was doing exactly that. Feeding divisions into Verdun, fighting for every meter, refusing to give ground. But the plan, if it ever really existed, had a fatal flaw. France was bleeding, but so was Germany. The casualties were mounting on both sides at roughly equal rates. For every French division fed into the Verdun furnace, Germany was committing comparable forces. And Germany, with fewer reserves, a smaller population, and an economy slowly strangling under blockade, could less afford the losses. By mid-March, some German commanders were beginning to question the entire operation. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, one of Germany's most capable field commanders, though not directly involved in the Verdun offensive, wrote in his diary on March 20th. His assessment was damning. After a lovely early success, everything bogged down and the operation so much as failed. 3 weeks into the offensive, one of Germany's best generals already pronouncing it a failure. But the battle would continue for 9 more months. While German forces battered themselves against French defences on both banks of the Meuse, General Pétain was systematically transforming how France fought the battle. His innovations would not only save Verdun, but would influence French military doctrine for decades to come. First, Pétain established a defence-in-depth system. This was a departure from traditional defensive thinking, which emphasized holding a single strong front line at all costs. Instead, Pétain created multiple defensive lines behind the front. If Germans captured the first line, there was a second line behind it, and a third behind that. Each line was far enough back that German artillery would have to displace forward before pounding the next position. This made breakthrough nearly impossible. Germans would have to fight through layer after layer of defences. By the time they broke through one line and prepared to assault the next, French reinforcements would have arrived and French artillery would have been repositioned. The system was designed to absorb German attacks rather than try to stop them dead at the front line. Trade space for time. Wear down the attackers. Make every meter cost German lives. Second, Pétain solved the critical logistics problem. Verdun's position as a salient meant it was desperately difficult to supply. The main railway line had been cut by German artillery in the first days of the offensive. Only one road remained open, the secondary road running from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, roughly 75 kilometers. This road became known as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Pétain ordered thousands of trucks to shuttle supplies up this road day and night. At peak operation, a truck passed every 14 seconds. It was one of the first examples of mass motorized supply in military history. Previously, armies had relied on railways to move bulk supplies, with horse-drawn wagons handling final distribution. But trucks offered flexibility that railways couldn't match. They could deliver supplies directly to forward positions. They could respond quickly to changing tactical situations. They didn't require fixed infrastructure that could be destroyed by enemy artillery. The Voie Sacrée required constant maintenance. The road surface was quickly torn up by thousands of heavy trucks running day and night. Army engineers worked around the clock, filling potholes, repairing damage, spreading gravel. Territorial reserve soldiers, older men not fit for frontline combat, stood along the road with shovels and stone, ready to repair damage immediately. The system worked. French forces at Verdun never ran critically short of ammunition, food, or medical supplies. This logistical achievement was as important to the defense as any tactical innovation. Without the Voie Sacrée, Verdun would have fallen within weeks. French forces also worked frantically to build an additional railway line to supplement the road. This Voie de Soixante, 60-centimetre narrow-gauge railway, snaked through the hills south of Verdun, staying out of range of German artillery. By April, this railway was operational, further easing the supply situation. The Germans had started the battle with a significant advantage in railway logistics. Their lines ran close to Verdun from multiple directions. Now, the French had partly negated that advantage through motor transport and rapid railway construction. But Petain's most important innovation was the Noria rotation system. The Noria, named after a type of water wheel that rotates continuously, was a systematic way of rotating units through the Verdun sector. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Units would be sent to Verdun, fight for a limited period, usually 1 or 2 weeks, and then be rotated out before they were completely destroyed. This was radically different from standard practice. Previously, divisions would be committed to a sector and kept there until they were shattered, sometimes for months. Only when a unit had been reduced to a fraction of its strength would it be withdrawn and rebuilt. The result was that relatively few units saw action in any given battle, but those that did were utterly destroyed. Petain's system was the opposite. Many units would see action, but none would be completely shattered. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers knew they wouldn't be left at Verdun until they died or went mad. They would get rotated out. They just had to survive their time at the front. This knowledge helped men endure conditions that might otherwise have broken them. The result of the Noria system was that roughly 70 to 75% of the entire French army would eventually fight at Verdun at some point during the 10-month battle. This created a shared national experience. Almost every French soldier had a Verdun story. Almost every French family knew someone who had fought there. Among the hundreds of thousands of French soldiers who rotated through Verdun were several men who would later become prominent in French political life. Captain Charles de Gaulle fought at Verdun with the 33rd Infantry Regiment. He would be wounded and captured in March 1916 and spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. Decades later, he would lead Free France during World War II and serve as President of France. Pierre Lebrun fought at Verdun as an artillery officer. He would later serve as President of France in the early 1930s. René Coty served at Verdun as a reserve officer. He would become President of France in the 1950s. The battle shaped these men and hundreds of thousands like them. The German approach was very different. Fifth Army often kept divisions in the line at Verdun until they were completely exhausted and shattered. A German division might fight for weeks or even months before being withdrawn. By the time a German unit was finally pulled out, it might have lost 50 or 60 or 70% of its strength. Survivors were traumatized. Unit cohesion was destroyed. It would take months to rebuild the division with fresh replacements and train them. This approach had predictable effects on German morale. German soldiers could see that French units across no man's land were being rotated regularly. Fresh French troops would arrive, fight for a week or two, then disappear, replaced by another fresh unit. Meanwhile, German soldiers stayed at Verdun until they were finished. Why were they left to die when the enemy was being rotated out? Resentment grew. The difference between French and German approaches to troop rotation would have major consequences as the battle dragged on for months. As French determination to hold Verdun became clear, the battle also became a propaganda war. In the first few days of the German offensive, when Fort Douaumont fell and French forces were reeling, French newspapers had downplayed Verdun's importance. It was just one sector among many, not strategically critical. The army was conducting an orderly fighting withdrawal. But once Pétain's defences stabilised and it became clear France would fight for Verdun, French media reversed course completely. Now, Verdun became a symbol of national will. The defence of Verdun was equated with France's refusal to submit to German aggression. Pétain's order of the day, "Courage on les aura," meaning "courage, we will get them," was reproduced in newspapers across France. General Robert Nivelle, commanding the French Second Army under Pétain, issued his own famous order, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. This phrase became one of the most famous slogans of the entire war. It appeared on propaganda posters, in newspaper headlines, in patriotic songs. "They shall not pass" encapsulated French determination to hold Verdun no matter the cost. German propaganda found itself in a difficult position. In the first days of the offensive, German newspapers had raised expectations with headlines about the great victory. Fort Douaumont had fallen. The French were retreating. Verdun would fall within days. Now, weeks into the battle, the German public was asking, "Where is the victory?" German papers like the Kriegsecho shifted their focus to enemy casualties. Articles emphasized not territorial gains but the losses being inflicted on France. "Our attack is progressing, with difficulty but irresistibly," one article proclaimed. Verdun is an immense furnace where the best of France's strength is burning. Another article compared Verdun to Moloch, the ancient Canaanite god who devoured children as sacrifices. Verdun was eating France's sons. The metaphor was accurate, but it applied equally to German sons burning in the same furnace. By mid-March, both nations were locked into the battle. Neither could afford to back down. Neither could find a way out. And the real horror of Verdun was only beginning. As the battle ground into March and April, the conditions at Verdun descended into something beyond the imagination of men who hadn't experienced it. The relatively small battlefield, perhaps 15 kilometers wide and 10 deep, was being systematically pulverized by hundreds of guns firing day and night. The sound never stopped. Even during lulls in the infantry fighting, the artillery continued. German guns pounding French positions. French guns firing back at German trenches. The earth itself seemed to shake continuously. Men learned to distinguish shells by sound. The sharp crack of 77mm field guns. The deeper boom of heavy howitzers. The terrifying freight train roar of super-heavy siege mortars whose shells took long seconds to arrive. That last sound, the approaching roar of a heavy shell, gave men just enough time to realize they were about to die. The landscape itself was being transformed. Before the battle, the region around Verdun had been beautiful. Rolling hills covered with forests. Small villages. Farms and orchards. By March, it was becoming a moonscape. The forests were reduced to fields of splinters. Not trees anymore, just jagged stumps and shattered trunks. In some areas, the woods had been so thoroughly destroyed that you couldn't tell there had ever been trees there. The villages were erased. Places like Fleury, Douaumont village, Vaux village, wiped from the map. Not damaged. Not ruined. Simply gone. Nothing left but brick dust and shell craters. The earth itself was churned into a soup. The winter mud, already bad, was turned into something worse by the constant bombardment. Shells would explode, throwing up tons of earth. Then more shells would hit the same area, churning it again. And again. And again. The result was a landscape of overlapping shell craters filled with muddy water. Some craters were so large you could hide a house in them. Trenches, the organized defensive systems that had characterized warfare since late 1914, no longer existed in many sectors. They would be dug, then destroyed by bombardment, then dug again, then destroyed again. Eventually, men stopped trying to maintain continuous trench lines. The front line became whatever shell holes men could find and connect. A string of craters, each holding a handful of soldiers. No communication trenches. No organized system. Just isolated groups of men trying to survive. And everywhere, covering this entire nightmare landscape, were the dead. Tens of thousands of corpses. Bodies in shell holes. Bodies in collapsed trenches. Bodies hanging on barbed wire. Bodies half buried in the mud. Bodies torn apart by shells. The constant bombardment made it impossible to retrieve the dead. Any attempt to recover bodies during daylight drew immediate fire. At night, burial parties might manage to inter a few corpses, but the next day's shelling would unearth them again. So, the bodies just became part of the landscape. Men built fortifications using corpses. They slept in shell holes with dead men. They walked on bodies. The smell of decomposition was so thick it seemed to coat your throat. French soldier Hervé Lambert wrote a letter home that captured the horror. A couple of lines from the trenches and mass graves where we are. From my squad, there are still 4 of us, out of 9. As to the view I have in front of me, it's overwhelming. Corpses are touching one another, piled up on top of one another, with a smell of decomposing bodies that sticks in your throat. It's horrific, with craters so large you could put a tram in them. I won't say any more. Lambert didn't need to say more. His family could imagine. Medical services had essentially broken down. The carefully organized system of aid stations, field hospitals, and ambulance services that existed in other sectors couldn't function under the intensity of fire at Verdun. Wounded men often had to fend for themselves. They would crawl back from the front line if they could. If they couldn't, if they were too badly wounded or the fire was too heavy, they would lie in shell holes for hours or days, waiting for stretcher bearers who might never come. Many men died not from their wounds, but from exposure, thirst, and shock while lying in no man's land waiting for help that never arrived. Even basic necessities like drinkable water became deadly challenges. Supply parties bringing water forward to the front lines had to run a gauntlet of artillery fire. Many were killed before reaching the trenches. The men at the front often went days without adequate water. One German soldier later wrote about the water hole near Douaumont village, one of the few sources of water in the area. We had to walk 1,000 meters to Fort Douaumont from a ravine. It was raining and mud was everywhere. One passed a water hole from which water was trickling. This corner was where earlier the village of Douaumont had been. But before you got to the water, you had to clamber over dozens of corpses. The French knew about the water source and shelled it regularly. There lay infantrymen, pioneers, all in piles on top of each other. Every one of them wanted water, but got none. Think about that for a moment. You're desperately thirsty. You know there's water 1,000 meters away. But to reach it, you have to cross ground that's under constant artillery fire. Then you have to climb over piles of dead men, men who had tried to reach the same water and failed. And even if you make it to the water, you're still under fire. The enemy knows you'll come. They're waiting. Do you risk it? Or do you stay in your shell hole and slowly die of thirst? These were the choices men faced every day at Verdun. Sleep became almost impossible. The artillery never completely stopped. Even during lulls, there would be harassing fire. Men would start to drift off, then a shell would explode nearby and jolt them awake. The constant fear, the knowledge that the next shell might land directly in your position, made genuine rest impossible. Men could go days without sleep. When they finally collapsed from exhaustion, they would sleep through bombardments that would have terrified them when fresh. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical danger. Soldiers at Verdun began exhibiting symptoms that doctors would later recognize as severe combat stress reaction, what was then called shell shock. Men would shake uncontrollably, become unable to speak, stare blankly at nothing. Some would simply stop functioning, sitting in their shell holes, unable or unwilling to move even when ordered. Others broke in more dramatic ways. They would run, just suddenly stand up and run toward the rear, heedless of machine gun fire or orders to stop. Some ran toward the enemy lines, preferring to be shot or captured rather than endure another minute of the bombardment. Military authorities on both sides initially treated these men as cowards or malingerers. But as the numbers grew, as more and more men broke under the strain, it became clear this was something different. This was what happened when you pushed human beings beyond their limits. The battle had become something that transcended normal military operations. This wasn't warfare, as it had been understood for thousands of years. This was industrial-scale slaughter. Human beings fed into a machine that chewed them up and spat them out. And it would continue for 7 more months. Through April and May, French commanders convinced themselves that the German offensive was spent. The logic seemed sound. Germany had launched a massive attack in February, achieved dramatic initial gains, then been stopped cold by French defences. Since early March, the Germans had been battering themselves against French positions with minimal progress. Surely they would recognise the offensive had failed and pull back. They were wrong. The German attacks continued through April and May with the same methodical intensity. The pattern was always the same. Days of artillery bombardment would pulverize a section of French line. Then German infantry would attack. They would gain a few hundred meters, sometimes capture a trench line or a strong point. Then French forces would counterattack, trying to retake what they'd lost. More artillery, more casualties. The lines would shift back and forth by a few hundred meters. At the end of each week, when staff officers drew the new positions on their maps, the front lines had barely moved. But the casualty lists grew longer and longer. On both sides, more divisions were being fed into the Verdun furnace. The French Noria rotation system meant a constant stream of units moving in and out of the sector. A division would fight for 10 days or 2 weeks, suffer perhaps 20 or 30% casualties, then be withdrawn and replaced. The Germans continued their approach of keeping units in line until they were shattered. A German division might stay at Verdun for a month or more, fighting until it was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Both systems consumed men at a terrifying rate. On May 8th, disaster struck inside Fort Douaumont. The fort, captured by Germany on February 25th with barely a shot fired, had become a major German strongpoint. Thousands of German soldiers used its deep underground galleries as shelter from French artillery. German supply dumps were located in the fort's magazines. That morning, something went wrong with the storage of flamethrower fuel or hand grenades. The exact cause was never conclusively determined. Fire broke out in one of the underground galleries. The flames spread to ammunition stores. Then the ammunition exploded. The explosion was massive, so large that French troops across the battlefield thought a mine had been detonated. The entire fort shook. Smoke and flames poured from the galleries. Nearly 700 German soldiers were killed instantly. Most died from the explosion itself, or from the toxic smoke that filled the underground passages. Many bodies were never recovered. Some galleries had to be sealed with the dead still inside because the fire and smoke made recovery impossible. It was one of the worst single-day disasters for German forces in the entire battle. And it happened inside their own captured fortress, not from enemy action. The explosion didn't force Germany to abandon Fort Douaumont. It was too important strategically. But it demonstrated the dangers of concentrating troops in confined spaces under constant artillery fire. Through April and May, the Germans did inch the lines forward despite French resistance. On the West Bank, they continued grinding toward Hill 304 and Le Morton. Progress was measured in meters. Each meter cost dozens or hundreds of casualties. On the East Bank, German forces pushed toward Fort Vaux, another of the major fortifications in the Verdun defensive system. Unlike Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux was actually defended. It had a garrison. It had artillery. And its commander was determined to hold. By early June, German forces had surrounded Fort Vaux. The siege was beginning. Meanwhile, the propaganda war intensified on both sides. French newspapers continued to emphasize the heroic defense of Verdun. Stories of individual acts of bravery filled the papers. The message was consistent. French soldiers were refusing to let the Germans pass. Pétain's defensive system and Nivelle's slogan, "Ils ne passeront pas," had become central to French national identity. Verdun was no longer just a military operation. It was a test of French national will. German propaganda found itself in an increasingly difficult position. The German public had been told in February that a great victory was imminent, is less than Hachon, 0 is greater than Fort Douaumont had fallen. Verdun would soon follow. Now it was May, 3 months later, and the battle was still raging. Where was the victory? German newspapers like the Kriegsecho continued to emphasize French casualties. Articles described Verdun as an immense furnace burning up France's strength. The battle was compared to Moloch, the ancient god who devoured children. The metaphor was accurate. Verdun was devouring men on both sides. But German propaganda couldn't acknowledge that German casualties were also mounting at an unsustainable rate. Couldn't admit that the offensive had stalled. Couldn't tell the German people that their sons were dying in the same furnace for no clear gain. So the papers kept printing stories about French losses, about how close Germany was to victory, about how the French were on the verge of collapse. None of it was true. By late May, even some German officers were beginning to question the operation privately. But publicly, the offensive continued. More divisions fed forward. More artillery brought up. More shells fired. More men killed. The machinery of the battle had taken on a life of its own. Neither side seemed able to stop it. By early June, German forces had completely surrounded Fort de Vaux. The fort sat on a low hill on the east bank of the Meuse, about 4 kilometers northeast of Verdun. It was smaller than Fort Douaumont, but still a formidable defensive position. Thick concrete walls, steel turrets, deep underground galleries. Unlike Douaumont, Fort de Vaux had an actual garrison. Approximately 600 men under the command of Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal. They were about to endure one of the most harrowing sieges of the entire war. The German assault on Fort de Vaux began on June 1st with a massive artillery bombardment. Heavy and super heavy guns pounded the fort day and night. The shells, some weighing over 400 kilograms, smashed into the concrete walls and steel turrets. The fort's construction was solid enough that the bombardment didn't breach the main walls. But the concussion of the shells hitting the fort was devastating to the men inside. Each impact shook the entire structure. Dust and concrete fragments filled the air in the underground galleries. The noise was indescribable. Men's ears bled from the constant concussion. After several days of bombardment, German infantry assaulted the fort directly. This wasn't like the capture of Douaumont, walking into an undefended fortress. This was brutal, close-quarters combat. German troops would fight their way into the outer defences of the fort. French defenders would counter-attack with grenades and rifle fire, pushing them back. The Germans would attack again and again, slowly working their way closer to the main structure. By June 4th, Germans controlled the surface of the fort, the superstructure and the immediate area around it. But the French garrison remained in the underground galleries, refusing to surrender. Now began the most terrible phase of the siege. The French garrison was completely cut off. No reinforcements could reach them. No supplies could get through. Communication with the outside world was severed when German artillery cut the telephone lines. Major Raynal tried sending messages via carrier pigeons. Most were shot down by German riflemen or killed by artillery fragments. One pigeon, named Valiant, did make it through with a message describing the desperate situation. The garrison was running out of everything. Ammunition was low, but not critical. The men were conserving rounds, firing only when necessary. Food was scarce. The men were on reduced rations. But hunger, while terrible, wasn't the worst problem. The worst problem was water. The fort's water supply came from cisterns, large underground tanks that collected rainwater. These cisterns had been damaged in the bombardment. Water was leaking away. By June 5th, the water situation was becoming desperate. The garrison was down to a few litres per man per day. Then a few cups. Then nothing. The galleries were hot and stifling. The air was thick with dust, cordite smoke, and the smell of unwashed bodies. Men were sweating constantly. They needed water desperately. And there was none. Major Raynal later described what happened next. Men were overcome with vomiting, for so wretched were they that they had reached the point of drinking their own urine. Some lost consciousness. In the main gallery, a man was licking a small wet streak on the wall. Think about that image. A French soldier, reduced by thirst to such desperation that he's licking moisture from a stone wall. This was what the Battle of Verdun did to men. The German troops surrounding the fort knew the garrison was suffering. They could hear the French inside, coughing, moaning, sometimes screaming. German commanders sent messages demanding surrender. They promised the garrison would be treated with honor, that the suffering would end if Major Raynal gave up. Raynal refused. Days passed. The suffering in the fort became almost unbearable. Men were delirious from thirst. Some were dying. French forces outside the fort tried desperately to break through and relieve the garrison. Several relief attacks were launched. All failed. The French simply couldn't break through German lines. Finally, on June 7th, nearly a week after the siege began, Major Raynal made the decision. He could not ask his men to endure any more. They had fought with incredible courage. They had held far longer than anyone had a right to expect. But they were finished. Major Raynal surrendered Fort de Vaux on June 7, 1916. The German troops who entered the fort were shocked by what they found. The French defenders were barely able to stand. Emaciated, delirious with thirst. Some had to be carried out on stretchers. The Germans, to their credit, treated the garrison with respect. They gave the French soldiers water immediately, provided medical care. Even German officers reportedly saluted Major Raynal for his defense. But the propaganda value of capturing Fort de Vaux was enormous. German newspapers announced another great victory. Two of Verdun's major forts, Douaumont and now Vaux, were in German hands. Surely the city itself would fall soon. There was a bitter irony in the timing. German commanders had planned to capture Fort de Vaux quickly, perhaps in a few days, as part of the initial February offensive. Instead, it took from February 21st to June 7th, 108 days. The short, sharp operation to take Verdun had now lasted more than 3 months. And despite capturing 2 major forts and pushing the French back several kilometers, German forces were no closer to actually taking Verdun than they had been in March. The French line was bending, but it wasn't breaking. On June 23rd, Germany launched another major attack. This time, they used a new weapon on a large scale, phosgene gas shells. Phosgene was more deadly than the chlorine gas used earlier. It killed more quickly and was harder to detect. The attack made progress. German forces captured the ruins of Fleury village, though calling it a village was misleading since nothing remained but brick dust and shell craters. On the West Bank, after months of grinding combat, German forces finally wrestled control of Le Mortagne and Hill 304 from the French. These were real gains. Significant tactical successes. But they had taken 4 months to achieve. 4 months of constant combat. Hundreds of thousands of casualties. And still, the Germans hadn't taken the Eastern Heights. Hadn't reached Verdun itself. hadn't achieved the breakthrough Falkenhayn had planned in December. The offensive that was supposed to last days or weeks had now consumed 4 months, and it showed no signs of ending. By early April, just 6 weeks into the offensive, Falkenhayn was already having doubts. The doubts weren't public. German newspapers still trumpeted progress at Verdun. Official statements remained confident. But privately, Falkenhayn was beginning to realize the offensive wasn't working as planned. On April 8th, he floated an idea to his staff. Perhaps they should consider breaking off the attack at Verdun. His reasoning was brutally pragmatic. Certainly, it will then be said we had not won the Battle of Verdun, he acknowledged. But that is being said even now, and we can and must accept that. If we win the battle, our chances to end the war very much increase. If we do not win the battle, our final victory will be delayed but not impinged if we decide not to uselessly bite our teeth out at Verdun. It was a rare moment of clarity. Falkenhayn could see the trap closing. Germany had already lost several teeth at Verdun. Continuing might just mean losing more for no gain. But he didn't act on this insight. A month later, on May 8th, Falkenhayn admitted to Kaiser Wilhelm that the battle had reached an impasse. An impasse. After more than 2 months of the heaviest fighting in the war, after tens of thousands of German casualties, after capturing Fort Douaumont and pushing the French back kilometers. An impasse. So why did Falkenhayn continue the offensive? If he knew in April it wasn't working, if he admitted in May it had reached a stalemate, why didn't he stop? Several factors drove the decision to persist. First, Fifth Army Command, especially General Schmidt von Kabelsdorff, believed they could still prevail. Schmidt von Knobelsdorff had been arguing since January that both banks of the Meuse needed to be attacked. Now, Germany was attacking both banks. Progress was being made. The French seemed to be weakening. One more big push might break them. Second, there was the embarrassment of withdrawing. Germany had publicly committed to the Verdun offensive. German newspapers had announced great victories. The public expected Verdun to fall. To pull back now would be to admit the entire operation had failed. That tens of thousands of German soldiers had died for nothing. The political and psychological cost would be enormous. Third, and perhaps most important, Falkenhayn began to believe his own propaganda. German intelligence reports on French casualties were wildly optimistic. By midsummer, German estimates put French losses at 525,000 or even 800,000 killed and wounded. Compared to only 225,000 German casualties. If these numbers were true, Germany was winning the battle of attrition by a massive margin. France was being bled white, just as Falkenhayn claimed he had planned. One more month of this, one more big offensive, and France would collapse. There was only one problem. The numbers were completely wrong. In reality, French casualties by midsummer were only about 10% higher than German casualties. France was suffering terribly, but so was Germany. The intelligence failure happened because German analysts fundamentally misunderstood the French Noria rotation system. German observers would see a fresh French division appear in the Verdun sector. After a week or two, that division would disappear and a different division would take its place. The Germans assumed this meant the first division had been destroyed, shattered by combat, withdrawn to be completely rebuilt. In reality, the first division had been rotated out while still combat effective. It had taken casualties, perhaps 20 or 30%, but it wasn't destroyed. It would rest, receive replacements, and potentially return to Verdun later. This misunderstanding led German intelligence to massively overestimate French casualties. They thought they were destroying dozens of French divisions. They were actually just seeing the same divisions rotate through multiple times. Falkenhayn believed the inflated casualty estimates. He wanted to believe them. They confirmed his strategy was working. After the gains of late May and June, capturing Fort de Vaux, taking Fleury, finally securing Le Mort-Homme and Hill 304, Falkenhayn became confident again. He predicted the war would be over by the end of the coming winter. France was on the verge of collapse. Just a few more months of pressure at Verdun would break them. He even lied to Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg about German casualties, understating them to maintain political support for the offensive. But other German leaders were losing faith in Falkenhayn. General Max von Gollwitz, one of Germany's senior commanders, remarked sarcastically that at the current rate of progress, they would reach Verdun by 1920. Admiral Georg Alexander von Müller, chief of the German Imperial Naval Cabinet, wrote in his diary about the growing crisis of confidence. Great unhappiness with the Kaiser, who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, and with Falkenhayn, who thinks everything is normal at Verdun. In July, Falkenhayn ordered one final major offensive. One last attempt to capture the remaining French strongholds on the eastern heights and break through to Verdun itself. It failed. German forces made some initial gains but couldn't achieve a breakthrough. French defences held. The offensive ground to a halt with heavy German casualties. By August, the German government had had enough. Falkenhayn was removed from his position as chief of the German General Staff. He was replaced by the team of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, the generals who had won dramatic victories on the Eastern Front. One of Hindenburg's first orders was to declare an end to major offensive operations at Verdun. After 5 months of grinding combat, after hundreds of thousands of casualties, after consuming irreplaceable reserves, Germany was giving up on the Verdun offensive. So, why did Germany's gamble at Verdun fail? The question has obsessed military historians for over a century. The debate continues, but several factors stand out. First, Germany never had a clear strategic goal beyond taking the Meuse Heights. All the debate about whether Falkenhayn intended to take Verdun or bleed France misses a fundamental point. There's no evidence he had a detailed plan for what would happen after either outcome. Take Verdun, then what? Would France collapse? Would they seek peace? How would Britain react? What would Germany do with the forces freed up by Verdun's fall? Bleed France white, then what? At what point would French casualties become unsustainable? What mechanism would force France to seek peace is less than #0. 5# is greater than what if Britain simply took over more of the Western Front? These questions didn't have answers. Falkenhayn seems to have hoped that applying enough pressure on France would somehow shift the strategic balance. But hope isn't strategy. Crown Prince Ruprecht's March diary entry captured this perfectly. Falkenhayn wasn't clear what he wanted. He was waiting for a stroke of good luck to bring an advantageous solution. That's not a plan. That's wishful thinking. Second, Germany overestimated German capabilities and underestimated French capabilities. German military culture in 1916 was convinced of German superiority. German soldiers were supposedly better trained, better led, more disciplined than their enemies. German tactics were supposedly superior. This wasn't entirely wrong. German stormtrooper tactics were innovative. German artillery was well coordinated. German operational planning was often excellent. But it led to dangerous assumptions. Germans assumed French soldiers were inferior. That French national character was hysterical and emotional. That French morale would crack under pressure. The reality was very different. French soldiers at Verdun fought with extraordinary courage and determination. French defensive tactics, Pétain's defense-in-depth system, proved highly effective. French logistics, the voie sacrée and the Noria rotation, were actually superior to German approaches. Germany also underestimated French will. Once France decided Verdun must be held, French determination proved unshakable. No amount of German pressure could break it. Third, critical operational mistakes in the first week. Most historians agree that if Falkenhayn had committed more infantry divisions to the initial February offensive, Germany probably could have captured the Meuse Heights. The window was open February 21st through 28th. French defences were shattered. Reserves hadn't arrived. One more massive push would likely have succeeded. But Falkenhayn wanted to preserve reserves. He believed artillery could do most of the work with minimal infantry. So he held back divisions that might have made the difference. By the time Falkenhayn realized he needed those reserves, the window had closed. French reinforcements had arrived. The opportunity was gone. Falkenhayn himself admitted after the war that not attacking both banks of the Meuse from the start was a mistake. That single decision, attacking East Bank only, created the tactical nightmare that plagued German operations for months. Crown Prince Ruprecht pronounced the operation a failure as early as March 20th. After a lovely early success, everything bogged down and the operation so much as failed. 3 weeks into the offensive, one of Germany's best generals already calling it a failure. But the offensive would continue for 7 more months. Finally, Germany fell victim to the sunk cost fallacy. By April, it was clear the offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. By May, Falkenhayn admitted it had reached an impasse. By June, German casualties had mounted to catastrophic levels. But Germany couldn't stop. Too much had been invested. Too many men had died. Too much political capital had been spent. Pulling back would mean admitting it had all been for nothing. So more divisions were fed into Verdun. More shells were fired. More men were killed, trying to somehow redeem the enormous investment that had already been made. This is the tragedy of Verdun. Both sides knew by midsummer that the battle had become futile, but neither could find a way to stop. From February to August, the Battle of Verdun could be considered a tactical German success. They had gained ground, captured forts, pushed the French back. But strategically, it was already a German defeat. Germany had wasted 5 months and hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable troops. They hadn't knocked France out of the war, hadn't even come close. France was weakened, but still fighting, still holding the majority of the Western Front, still attacking on the Somme alongside the British. And Germany's strategic position was worse than when the battle began. While German High Command debated strategy and French High Command managed the Noria rotation, the soldiers at the front endured conditions that were pushing them beyond human limits. In May, French High Command made a leadership change. General Pétain was promoted to command of Army Group Centre. General Robert Nivelle took over command of Second Army and direct responsibility for Verdun's defence. Nivelle was an artillery specialist, a gunner who believed in aggressive, offensive action. He was less cautious than Pétain, more willing to counter-attack and retake lost ground. In late June, as Germany's offensive stalled, Joffre made another decision. He began shifting French forces north, away from Verdun, to prepare for the great Allied offensive on the Somme that would begin on July 1st. This shift reflected French High Command's correct assessment that German offensive power at Verdun was spent. The danger of a breakthrough had passed. Now, it was time to hit Germany elsewhere. But for the soldiers who remained at Verdun through July, August, and September, the battle continued with the same grinding intensity. The fighting in these months was mostly small-scale tactical actions. No more grand offensives by either side. No dramatic shifts in the front lines. Just constant, grinding combat. German forces would attack a French position. Artillery barrage. Infantry assault. Perhaps they'd take the position. Then French forces would counterattack. More artillery. More infantry. Perhaps the French would retake it. A week later, the position would change hands again. And again. The same shell holes and ruins fought over repeatedly. To what end? Nobody could really say anymore. The psychological toll on soldiers was becoming catastrophic. French soldier Marc Boasson, a veteran who had survived months at Verdun, reached his breaking point sometime that summer. He wrote words that captured what the battle had done to the men who fought it. This is not heroism. This is ignominy. What kind of a nation will they make of us tomorrow, these exhausted creatures, emptied of blood, emptied of thought, crushed by superhuman fatigue? Read those words again. Exhausted creatures, emptied of blood, emptied of thought. This is what Verdun did. It didn't just kill men. It emptied them. Mark Boasson would be killed later in the battle. One more name added to the casualty lists. One more exhausted creature who couldn't survive. German soldiers were no better off. The German refusal to implement a rotation system, like the French Noria, meant many German units stayed at Verdun for months. The psychological strain accumulated. Men began to experience hallucinations. The stress, the lack of sleep, the constant fear, it broke the mind's ability to process reality correctly. A German-Danish soldier named Jeppesen later wrote about his experience one night at Verdun. He was on watch in a forward position when something caught his attention. Suddenly, I saw a monster right in front of me. It was standing and beckoning me to it. I could feel the hairs standing up under my steel helmet. Jeppesen drew his revolver, flipped off the safety, and began crawling forward toward the monster. Slowly, carefully, certain he was about to die. But when I got to the monster, it turned out to be one of the small ponies used to pull the carts. It had died here during an explosion, and it had been raised on its rear legs. Now all the flesh was peeled from it, and the moonlight shone through the skeleton. Think about what this story reveals. First, the battlefield was so filled with corpses, both human and animal, that a rotting pony skeleton standing upright was just part of the landscape. Second, Jeppesen's mind, stressed beyond endurance, turned that skeleton into a monster beckoning him to death. Third, and perhaps most telling, Jeppesen found this experience worth writing about after the war. Among all his memories of Verdun, this particular hallucination stood out. What does that say about the other things he experienced that he didn't bother writing about? Through July, August, and September, both armies continued feeding men into Verdun. The French Noria system meant a constant stream of divisions rotating through. A division would arrive at Verdun, fight for 10 days or 2 weeks, suffer casualties, rotate out. Another division would take its place. By this point in the battle, roughly 70% of the entire French army had served at Verdun. Almost every French soldier had his Verdun story. Everyone knew what it meant when a unit received orders to go to Verdun. German units, kept in line longer, were being ground down more thoroughly. A division that entered Verdun at 60 or 70% strength might be reduced to 30% by the time it was finally withdrawn. The replacements who refilled these shattered divisions were increasingly young and poorly trained. Germany was running out of experienced soldiers. The men being sent to Verdun in late summer were often boys, 18 or 19 years old, with only a few weeks of training. They didn't last long. The artillery continued to dominate the battlefield. By this point, millions of shells had fallen on the Verdun sector. The landscape had been so thoroughly destroyed that aerial photographs showed almost no recognizable features. Just craters, overlapping craters, as far as the camera could see. The soil itself had been poisoned. The constant explosions, the gas shells, the chemicals from propellants, all of it seeped into the earth. Areas that had been farmland or forest before the war would remain toxic and unusable for decades after. Some zones, the areas of heaviest fighting, would be so contaminated with unexploded ordnance and chemicals that they would still be dangerous a century later. Death at Verdun came in countless forms. Artillery shells, of course. That was the primary killer, is less than #0, 5 hashes greater than high explosive. Shrapnel, the constant, random death falling from the sky. But also machine gun fire, rifle bullets, grenades, flamethrowers, poison gas. Men drowned in mud, were buried alive when trenches collapsed, died of infected wounds because medical care couldn't reach them, succumbed to disease in the filthy, unsanitary conditions. Some men simply died of exhaustion. Their bodies, pushed beyond endurance, just stopped. And some, though military records tried to hide these cases, took their own lives rather than endure another day. By September, even German high command recognized that the Verdun offensive had become a liability. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the new leadership team, had inherited a disaster. German forces were still attacking at Verdun, still suffering casualties, for no clear strategic purpose. But they couldn't simply abandon the positions Germany had fought for months to take. That would hand France a propaganda victory and waste all the sacrifices made so far. So German forces shifted to a defensive posture. They would hold what they'd taken, but no more major offensives. No more attempts to push toward Verdun itself. The German offensive phase of the battle was over. But the French weren't done. Through the summer, as German attacks petered out, General Nivelle had been planning. He was convinced that properly planned and executed attacks could retake the ground Germany had captured. He had studied the German failures, learned from them. He believed he knew how to use artillery and infantry together to break through German defences. In October, France would launch its own offensive at Verdun, and they would prove that defence wasn't the only thing the French army could do well. By late September, General Robert Nivelle had concluded that German offensive strength at Verdun was finally spent. The pattern was clear. German attacks through August and September had been smaller, less frequent, less intense. Germany was no longer trying to break through to Verdun. They were just holding what they'd taken. This shift from offense to defense created an opportunity. Nivelle believed French forces could retake much of the ground lost in February and March, but it would require meticulous planning and overwhelming force applied at decisive points. The French had learned hard lessons watching German offensives fail throughout the summer. They had seen what worked and what didn't. Now they would apply those lessons. First lesson: artillery preparation had to be absolutely overwhelming. Through October, French forces assembled 650 guns in the Verdun sector. This gave France roughly equal artillery strength to Germany for the first time since February. But Nivelle didn't want to bombard the entire German line. That would spread the fire too thin. Instead, he concentrated his artillery on a narrow front, just 2 or 3 kilometers wide. On this limited section, French artillery superiority would be overwhelming. Perhaps 3 or 4 French guns for every German gun. The French stockpiled 250,000 shells, not to be fired randomly over weeks, but concentrated in a few days of systematic bombardment. Second lesson: counter-battery fire was critical. German offensives had succeeded, partly because German artillery had suppressed French guns. If French guns couldn't fire, French defences collapsed. So Nivelle's plan focused heavily on destroying or neutralising German artillery before the infantry attack. The French developed an innovative tactic. They would fake the start of an attack with a brief, intense bombardment. German artillery batteries would respond, revealing their positions by muzzle flashes and sound. French aircraft, observation balloons, and forward observers would mark every German battery position. Then French counter-battery fire would systematically destroy them. This tactic worked better than Nivelle had dared hope. By the time the actual attack began, over 40% of German artillery batteries in the target sector had been completely knocked out. The remaining German guns were suppressed, constantly under fire themselves, unable to provide effective support to German infantry. Third lesson: the rolling barrage. This was a relatively new tactic that the British had been experimenting with on the Somme. French gunners refined it. Instead of firing at German trenches for hours or days, then stopping so infantry could attack, the artillery would keep firing as the infantry advanced. The shells would land just ahead of the attacking troops, perhaps 50 or 100 meters ahead. Then the fire would roll forward at a walking pace. The infantry would follow close behind the barrage. This meant German defenders would be under fire right up until the moment French infantry arrived. They wouldn't have time to man their positions, set up machine guns, or prepare to resist. The rolling barrage required precise coordination between artillery and infantry. If the infantry advanced too slowly, they'd fall behind the protective fire. If they advanced too quickly, they'd walk into their own shells. But if executed properly, it was devastatingly effective. Fourth lesson: infantry tactics had to be flexible and aggressive. French infantry would attack in small, specialized teams, not the mass waves that had characterized earlier offensives. Each team would include riflemen, grenadiers, soldiers with wire cutters, others carrying Bangalore torpedoes to blast through obstacles. Light machine gun teams would provide covering fire. The teams would be trained to bypass German strongpoints rather than assault them directly. Push through gaps. Get into the German rear areas. Cut communications. Spread confusion. German strongpoints left behind could be dealt with later by follow-on forces. The first wave's job was to penetrate deep and fast. By mid-October, everything was in place. 650 French guns ready to fire. 250,000 shells stockpiled. Infantry trained and rehearsed in the new tactics. Aircraft and observation balloons positioned. The targets were carefully chosen. Fort Douaumont, the fortress that had fallen without a fight in February, was the primary objective. Taking it back would have enormous symbolic value. Fort Vaux, where Major Raynal's garrison had held out for a week before surrendering in June, was the secondary objective. And Fleury village, or rather the ruins where Fleury had been before the battle obliterated it, was another target. Heavy rains through mid-October delayed the offensive. The ground, already churned into mud by months of shellfire, became nearly impassable. Nivelle waited for conditions to improve. Finally, on October 23rd, the weather cleared enough to proceed. At 7:30 in the morning, 650 French guns opened fire. The French counter-offensive at Verdun had begun. The French bombardment that began on October 23rd was unlike anything German forces at Verdun had experienced. For 8 months, German artillery had dominated the battlefield. German guns had pounded French positions with near impunity. German soldiers had grown accustomed to artillery superiority. Now, the situation was reversed. French guns systematically destroyed German positions. The narrow front Nivelle had chosen meant the bombardment was concentrated to an almost unbearable intensity. German trenches, already in poor condition after months of fighting, collapsed under the barrage. Communication lines were cut. Supply dumps were destroyed. German soldiers huddled in shell holes and dugouts, waiting for it to end. German artillery tried to respond. But French counter-battery fire had been devastatingly effective. Over 40% of German guns had been knocked out before the main bombardment even began. The batteries that remained were constantly under fire themselves. German gunners couldn't maintain sustained fire when French shells were landing on their positions every few minutes. At 11:40 on October 24th, after more than a full day of bombardment, French infantry attacked. The rolling barrage moved forward at exactly the rehearsed pace. Shells exploding just ahead of the advancing troops. A curtain of fire and steel sweeping across no man's land. French infantry followed close behind. Small teams moving fast, using the chaos of the barrage for cover. The German troops they encountered were stunned and disorganized. Many German soldiers at Verdun by late October were not the experienced veterans who had launched the offensive in February. Those men were mostly dead, wounded, or evacuated after months at the front. The troops now holding German positions were often young replacements. Poorly trained, inexperienced. They had been at Verdun for weeks or months, ground down by the constant attrition. Morale was terrible. German soldiers could see that French units across no man's land were rotated regularly. Fresh French troops would arrive, fight for a week or two, then leave. Meanwhile, German units stayed until they were destroyed. This difference in rotation policy had been wearing on German morale for months. By October, many German soldiers were simply exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. They were miserable, wet from constant rain, cold as autumn turned toward winter, hungry because supply lines were unreliable, living in shell holes because organized trenches no longer existed. And now they were under the most intense bombardment they had ever experienced, followed by a French infantry attack using tactics they hadn't seen before. German resistance collapsed quickly. French infantry broke through the German front line and pushed deep into the German defensive system. The small, flexible teams bypassed strongpoints just as they'd been trained to do. They got into the German rear areas, cutting communications and spreading panic. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered. Not in ones and twos, in entire units. A few dozen men here, 100 there. German soldiers who had simply had enough. They were done. 8 months at Verdun had broken them. They couldn't fight anymore. By the end of October 24th, just one day into the offensive, French forces had achieved their primary objectives. French colonial troops recaptured the ruins of Fleury village. The same ground Germany had taken with such effort in June was back in French hands. More importantly, Fort Douaumont was retaken. The fortress that had been captured by a small German patrol in February without a fight, the fortress whose capture German newspapers had trumpeted as a great victory, was now abandoned. German forces had evacuated it. The reason was simple. French super-heavy artillery, including massive 400mm guns, had been systematically pounding the fort for days. These enormous shells smashed through the concrete roof of Fort Douaumont. One penetrated deep into the fort's interior and started a fire. With the interior filling with smoke and the fort under constant bombardment, German commanders decided it was untenable. They evacuated the garrison before the French infantry attack even began. When French soldiers reached Fort Douaumont on October 24th, they found it empty. They simply walked in and reclaimed it. The symbolism was perfect. Fort Douaumont had been captured without a fight in February. Now it was recaptured without a fight in October. But the psychological impact was very different. In February, the fall of Douaumont had seemed to signal imminent German victory. In October, its recapture signaled that Germany had definitively lost the battle. One German soldier caught in the October attack was William Hermans. His unit was overrun during the night attack. In the chaos and darkness, Hermans became separated from his comrades. He tried to retreat, running through the darkness toward German lines. He fell into a large shell crater. As he tried to climb out, he suddenly realized he wasn't alone. 8 or 10 French soldiers rose before him. Huge men. They seemed huge in the darkness and his fear. One pointed a rifle at his head. Hermans was still in a half-kneeling position. He couldn't run, couldn't fight. This was the end. He cried out in French, "Pardon, je suis votre prisonnier." Forgive me, I am your prisoner. Somebody drew back the hand of the man with the gun. Hermans, almost babbling with fear and relief, stammered in broken French, "I don't hate you. I don't hate anyone." And then he collapsed. This moment, this German soldier in a crater, begging for his life, insisting he hates no one, captures something essential about what Verdun had become by October. This wasn't a war of ideologies anymore. It wasn't about German militarism versus French democracy. It wasn't about glory or honor or national destiny. It was just exhausted men killing each other because they didn't know how to stop. The French advance on October 24th had been spectacular. In a single day, French forces captured ground that had taken Germany months to conquer. Fort Douaumont retaken. Fleury village retaken. Thousands of German prisoners. The German defensive system on the east bank broken open. It was the most successful French offensive operation at Verdun since the battle began. On November 3rd, Fort Vaux was retaken. Like Douaumont, the Germans had abandoned it before French forces arrived. The fort that Major Raynal's garrison had defended so desperately in June, where French soldiers had drunk their own urine before surrendering, was now simply empty. German forces pulled back to new defensive positions. They were still holding ground east of Verdun, but the threat to the city itself had been decisively eliminated. Nivelle's counter-offensive had worked. His meticulous planning, his improved tactics, his overwhelming concentration of force on a narrow front, all of it had succeeded. Within days, French forces had recaptured what took Germany months to take. Through November, German forces tried to stabilize their positions. They had fallen back to new defensive lines east of Verdun. They were determined to hold what remained. But they were in no position to mount serious resistance. German troops at Verdun were exhausted. Morale was shattered. Supplies were inadequate. The October counter-offensive had shocked the German command. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who had taken over from Falkenhayn in August, now faced a dilemma similar to what Falkenhayn had faced in April. The Verdun operation had clearly failed. Continuing to hold advanced positions cost men and materiel for no strategic purpose. But pulling back entirely would hand France a complete propaganda victory. They chose a middle path. German forces would conduct a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions farther back. Give up some ground to shorten the line and reduce casualties. Meanwhile, Nivelle was planning one more offensive. The success in October had made him confident, perhaps overconfident. He believed he had solved the puzzle of trench warfare. With proper artillery preparation and proper infantry tactics, breakthrough was possible. This confidence would have major consequences in 1917. But that's another story. For now, Nivelle planned a December offensive to push German forces back even farther from Verdun. The pattern was the same as October. Massive artillery preparation, concentrated on a narrow front, rolling barrage, infantry following close behind. The December offensive began on December 15th. German forces were even less able to resist than they had been in October. Many units were shadows of their former strength. Replacements were young and inexperienced. Equipment was worn out. French forces advanced 3 more kilometers. Not a dramatic gain in absolute terms, but significant because it pushed the front line to a safer distance from Verdun itself. By the time the December offensive ended, Verdun was no longer under immediate threat. German artillery could no longer shell the city effectively. The fortress was secure. After 10 months, the the Battle of Verdun was essentially over. Small-scale fighting would continue into 1917. There was no formal end to the battle, no armistice or ceasefire. The guns just gradually fell silent as both sides shifted focus elsewhere. But by late December 1916, everyone knew it was over. General Paul von Hindenburg, now chief of the German General Staff, drew a pessimistic conclusion. He wrote about the October and December French counter-offensives. On this occasion, the enemy hoisted us with our own petard. We could only hope that in the coming year he would not repeat the experiment on a greater scale and with equal success. That sentence is fascinating for what it reveals. Hindenburg understood that France had learned from German tactics. The October offensive used the same principles Germany had employed in February: overwhelming artillery, concentration of force, infiltration tactics. France had taken Germany's methods and used them better. And Hindenburg feared, correctly, as it turned out, that France might try this on a larger scale in 1917. The Battle of Verdun, the longest battle of the First World War, was over. 300 days of continuous combat. February to December 1916. Germans called it the Blutpumpe, the blood pump, a machine that sucked in men and pumped out corpses. Now came the accounting. The final casualty figures for the Battle of Verdun would be debated by historians for decades. Record-keeping broke down during the most intense fighting. Many dead were never identified or counted. But the generally accepted numbers are these. France, 377,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Germany, 335,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Over 712,000 men killed or maimed. The numbers are so large, they become almost meaningless. The human mind can't really comprehend casualties on that scale. To put it in perspective, more men became casualties at Verdun than the entire population of most European cities in 1916. The United States, a nation of 90 million people, would lose fewer total military deaths in all of World War II than France and Germany lost at Verdun alone. And what did these casualties achieve? For Germany, nothing. They had not taken Verdun. They had not knocked France out of the war. They had not achieved any strategic objective. From February to August, the battle could be considered a German tactical success. They had advanced, captured forts, pushed France back. But from September to December, French forces retook much of what Germany had gained. By the end, the front lines were roughly where they'd been in February, perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers different. Strategically, Verdun was a complete German failure. Germany had wasted 10 months, consumed irreplaceable reserves, lost 335,000 men, and France was still in the war. Still fighting, still holding the majority of the Western Front, still capable of launching major offensives like the one on the Somme that summer. If anything, Germany's strategic position in December 1916 was worse than it had been in January. The Verdun operation had consumed resources Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Falkenhayn had not consulted with Austria-Hungary before launching the offensive. So Austria had not launched any supporting attacks to tie down Russian forces. In June, Russia launched the Brusilov offensive, one of the most successful Russian operations of the war. Austria-Hungary nearly collapsed. Germany had to rush troops east to stabilize the situation. Troops that might have been used at Verdun or on the Somme, where Britain launched its massive summer offensive, were instead diverted to save Austria. Germany was being pulled in too many directions, and Verdun had consumed reserves that might have made the difference on other fronts. For France, the outcome was more complex. Yes, France had held Verdun. The city had not fallen. By December, German forces had been pushed back to safe distance. This was a defensive victory. France had proven it could withstand Germany's best efforts to break through. But the cost was terrible. 377,000 casualties. Tens of thousands dead. Hundreds of thousands wounded, many permanently disabled. The French army, in December 1916, was weaker than it had been in January. Exhausted by 10 months of grinding combat, divisions that had rotated through Verdun needed time to rebuild. More seriously, French offensive capability had been damaged. The Somme offensive in summer 1916 achieved little at heavy cost. France simply didn't have enough fresh troops to sustain major operations on two fronts simultaneously. And there was a psychological cost that wouldn't become clear until 1917. The French army had defended Verdun successfully, but the experience had scarred it. Soldiers who had served at Verdun knew what modern industrial warfare could do to human beings. When French High Command ordered major offensives in 1917, when Nivelle, convinced his methods had solved trench warfare, launched attacks that failed catastrophically, parts of the French army would mutiny. The seeds of those mutinies were planted at Verdun. So neither side truly won at Verdun. Germany lost strategically, failing to achieve any meaningful objective while consuming irreplaceable resources. France won defensively, holding Verdun and eventually pushing German forces back. But the cost weakened France's ability to win the war. Both nations bled. Both were weaker in December than January. And over 700,000 men paid the price for a battle that achieved nothing decisive. The Battle of Verdun stands as one of history's great examples of strategic futility. A battle neither side could afford to lose, and neither side could win. So both kept fighting until exhaustion forced them to stop. Falkenhayn had gambled 335,000 German lives. France had gambled 377,000 lives. Neither gamble paid off. The Battle of Verdun began as an operational decision. It ended as something far more profound, a symbol that would define the First World War itself. This transformation happened gradually, driven by propaganda, collective experience, and the sheer scale of suffering the battle inflicted. In the first days of the German offensive, February 21st through 25th, 1916, French newspapers had downplayed Verdun's importance. Articles emphasized that Verdun was just one sector among many, not strategically critical. The army was conducting an orderly, fighting withdrawal. Tactical adjustments were being made. This messaging reflected French High Command's genuine belief in February that Verdun could be abandoned if necessary. But once Joffre decided Verdun must be held, once France committed to defending it at all costs, the media narrative reversed completely. Now, Verdun became a symbol of French national will. The defense of Verdun was no longer just a military operation. It became equated with France's refusal to submit to German aggression. To surrender Verdun would mean surrendering French honor, French pride, French independence itself. General Pétain's order of the day, "Courage, on les aura," meaning "Courage, we will get them," was printed in newspapers across France. It appeared on posters. In letters from the front, it became a rallying cry. General Robert Nivelle's slogan was even more powerful: "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. These 4 words, "they shall not pass," became one of the most famous phrases of the entire war. The phrase captured everything: French determination, defiance, refusal to yield. No matter the cost, no matter the suffering, the Germans would not pass. "Ils ne passeront pas" appeared everywhere in France. On propaganda posters showing French soldiers holding the line, in patriotic songs, in speeches by politicians, in letters from soldiers to their families. The slogan transcended Verdun itself. It became a statement about French national character, about what France would endure to remain free. Decades later, Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War would adopt the same slogan, "No pasarán," when defending Madrid against fascist forces. The echo of Verdun carried forward. German propaganda faced a much more difficult situation. In the first days of the offensive, German newspapers had raised expectations with triumphant headlines. Fort Douaumont captured, French forces retreating, the fall of Verdun imminent. The German public, hungry for good news after nearly 2 years of war, celebrated. Finally, a decisive victory was coming. But weeks passed. Then months. And Verdun had not fallen. German newspapers had to explain why the great victory they'd announced in February still hadn't materialized in March or April or May. They shifted focus from territorial gains to enemy casualties. Articles in papers like the Kriegsecho emphasized the losses being inflicted on France. The battle was described as an immense furnace where the best of France's strength is burning. One article compared Verdun to Moloch, the ancient Canaanite god who demanded child sacrifice. Verdun was devouring France's sons. France was bleeding to death. The metaphor was accurate. Verdun was indeed a furnace consuming men. But the article couldn't acknowledge that German sons were burning in the same fire. That Germany was bleeding just as heavily. That the strategy of bleeding France white was also bleeding Germany white. As the battle dragged on month after month, with no clear German victory, German propaganda became trapped. They couldn't admit the offensive had failed, but they couldn't claim victory either. So they just kept printing stories about French losses and claiming success was imminent. The German public grew increasingly skeptical. The contrast between French and German approaches to troop rotation also had propaganda implications. The French Noria system meant that roughly 70 to 75% of the entire French army fought at Verdun at some point during the 10 months. This created a shared national experience. Almost every French soldier had a Verdun story. Almost every French family knew someone who had served there. When soldiers returned from Verdun, traumatized but alive, they brought their stories home. Stories of suffering, yes, but also stories of resistance, of holding the line, of refusing to let the Germans pass. This mass experience turned Verdun into a collective French narrative. It wasn't just something the army did. It was something the nation endured together. Germany's approach was different. German units stayed at Verdun until they were shattered. Survivors were more thoroughly traumatized. And fewer German soldiers overall experienced Verdun directly. So, in Germany, Verdun became less of a shared national story and more of a nightmare that happened to specific unlucky units. By the end of 1916, Verdun meant very different things to France and Germany. For France, Verdun symbolized national determination. The ability to withstand the worst Germany could inflict and still stand firm. They shall not pass, and they had not passed. For Germany, Verdun symbolized strategic failure. A battle that consumed an army for no meaningful gain. A furnace that burned German strength as thoroughly as it burned French strength. But for the soldiers of both nations who had actually fought there, Verdun meant something else entirely. It meant hell. Pure, industrial, mechanized hell. The worst thing human beings could do to each other. 712,000 casualties. That number tells you almost nothing about what Verdun actually did to the men who fought there. Statistics can't capture the reality of soldiers who survived but never truly left the battlefield. Psychological wounds became as significant as physical ones. What doctors in 1916 called shell shock would later be recognized as severe combat stress reaction, post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who survived Verdun carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Nightmares that lasted for decades. Sudden panic attacks triggered by loud noises. Inability to tolerate enclosed spaces. Violent tremors. Moments when the mind simply left the present and returned to shell holes and bombardments. Some men never recovered. They spent the rest of their lives in psychiatric hospitals. Or became unable to work, to maintain relationships, to function in civilian society. The war had broken something fundamental inside them. French Lieutenant de Mazenod, who survived the battle, wrote words that proved prophetic. This war has marked us for generations. It has left its imprint upon our souls. All those inflamed nights of Verdun we shall rediscover one day in the eyes of our children. He was right. The trauma didn't end with the men who fought. It passed to their families, their children, in ways both obvious and subtle. The physical landscape was also destroyed beyond recovery. Villages that had existed for centuries were simply erased. Fleury, Douaumont village, Vol village, Beaumont, Louvemont, Besanvaux, all gone. Not damaged, not ruined, gone. Obliterated so thoroughly that in some cases archaeologists today still argue about exactly where the villages had stood. The forests were destroyed. Millions of artillery shells had turned ancient woodlands into fields of splinters and craters. Some areas remained so contaminated with unexploded ordnance and toxic chemicals that they couldn't be reforested for decades. After the war, French authorities designated a zone rouge, red zone, around Verdun. Thousands of hectares deemed too dangerous for human habitation. In some sections of the zone rouge, the soil was so poisoned that nothing would grow. The concentration of arsenic, lead, mercury, and other toxins from millions of shells made the earth itself deadly. A century later, in the 21st century, parts of the Zone Rouge remain dangerous. Unexploded shells still kill people. Farmers still call police every year when their ploughs unearth ordnance. Engineers estimate that some sections won't be safe for another 700 years. Think about that. The Battle of Verdun will be poisoning the earth for centuries longer than the French nation had existed when the battle was fought. The human cost extended beyond soldiers to entire communities. Consider French soldier Hervé Lambert. In his letter home, he wrote that 4 men from his squad of 9 remained. 5 dead. How many squads like Lambert's? Hundreds? Thousands? Each of those dead men left behind families. Mothers and fathers. Wives and children. Brothers and sisters. Communities where they'd lived. Small French villages lost entire age cohorts. In some communities, nearly every man between 18 and 30 died. The villages never recovered. Marc Boisson, who wrote about being reduced to an exhausted creature, emptied of blood, emptied of thought, was killed later in the battle. His words survived him. But Marc Boisson himself became just another name on the casualty lists. Another family destroyed. Another young man who would never return home. Multiply that by 712,000. Political leaders who fought at Verdun carried the experience into their future roles. Captain Charles de Gaulle was wounded and captured at Verdun in March 1916. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Germany. Decades later, as leader of Free France during World War II, and later as President of France, de Gaulle's worldview was shaped by his Verdun experience. His understanding of German military power, his belief in the importance of national will, his conviction that France must never again be unprepared for war. Pierre Lebrun fought at Verdun as an artillery officer. He became President of France in 1932. His presidency coincided with the rise of Hitler and German rearmament. His memories of Verdun surely influenced how he viewed the growing German threat. René Coty served at Verdun as a reserve officer. He became president of France in 1953. During his presidency, France faced the crisis of decolonization and the Algerian War. Again, his Verdun experience shaped his understanding of what nations could endure. These were men shaped by Verdun who would help shape France's future. The battle's influence extended decades beyond 1916. The symbolic weight of Verdun would only grow heavier with time. After World War II, another catastrophic conflict that killed millions, Verdun became a place of reconciliation rather than just remembrance. French and German leaders met at Verdun to symbolize the new friendship between former enemies. The battlefield that had symbolized hatred and destruction became a symbol of peace and cooperation. In 1966, French President Charles de Gaulle and German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer attended a ceremony at Verdun together. Former enemies standing side by side at the scene of mutual slaughter. In 1984, French President François Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl held hands at Douaumont Cemetery. The image became iconic. Two leaders whose nations had fought 3 wars in 70 years, now joined in shared mourning and shared commitment to peace. From killing ground to symbol of reconciliation. That transformation took decades, and it required another world war to make it possible. But the bodies buried at Verdun, French and German mixed together in the Douaumont ossuary, bore silent witness to the transformation. By late December 1916, the immediate consequences of Verdun were becoming clear. For Germany, the aftermath was catastrophic. Erich von Falkenhayn, the man who had planned and launched the Verdun offensive, had been removed from command in August. He was sent to command forces in Romania, a significant demotion for the former chief of the German General Staff. Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff now ran Germany's war effort. They inherited a strategic situation that was worse than it had been in January. German reserves had been consumed at Verdun for no meaningful gain. The army was exhausted. Morale was damaged. And Germany still faced the same strategic problem that had confronted Falkenhayn in December 1915. The Entente still had more men, more resources, more industrial capacity. Time still favoured Germany's enemies. The British blockade was slowly strangling the German economy. The riddle Falkenhayn had tried to solve with the Verdun offensive remained unsolved. Worse, Germany's strategic position had deteriorated in other areas because of Verdun. Austria-Hungary had nearly collapsed under the Brusilov offensive in summer 1916. Germany had been forced to send troops east to stabilize the situation, troops that might otherwise have been used on the Western Front. Romania had entered the war on the Entente side in August, opening yet another front Germany had to defend. And on the Somme, where Britain had launched its massive offensive in July, German forces had suffered another 250,000 casualties defending against British and French attacks. Germany had fought 3 major battles simultaneously in 1916: Verdun, the Brusilov offensive, and the Somme. It had won none of them decisively. And the cumulative casualties were staggering. General Hindenburg understood the situation. After the French October and December counter-offensives at Verdun, he wrote, "We could only hope that in the coming year the enemy would not repeat the experiment on a greater scale and with equal success. His hope would prove vain. In 1917, the Entente would launch even larger offensives, and Germany's ability to resist would be weaker than ever. For France, the aftermath was more complicated. France had held Verdun. The Germans had been pushed back. This was genuinely a defensive victory. Robert Nivelle, the general who had commanded the successful October and December counteroffensives, was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of French forces in December, replacing Joffre. Nivelle's success at Verdun had convinced him that he had solved the puzzle of trench warfare. With proper artillery preparation and proper infantry tactics, breakthrough was possible. Attacks could succeed. The war could be won. He planned a massive offensive for spring 1917, an operation that would supposedly end the war. He hadn't solved the puzzle. The October and December successes at Verdun had worked partly because German forces there were exhausted and demoralized after 8 months of combat. The same tactics would not work as well against fresh German troops in prepared positions. Nivelle's 1917 offensive would fail catastrophically, and the failure would trigger mutinies in the French army. Soldiers who had endured Verdun, who had held the line through the worst Germany could inflict, would refuse to participate in what they saw as pointless, suicidal attacks. The seeds of those mutinies were planted at Verdun. For the soldiers themselves, the aftermath was simply survival. Men like William Hermans, the German soldier who had surrendered in a shell crater, insisting, "I don't hate you, I don't hate anyone," would spend the rest of the war as prisoners. After the war, Hermans became a writer and peace activist. His message, shaped by his Verdun experience, was simple: war must never happen again. Nations must find other ways to resolve disputes. Many Verdun survivors became pacifists. They had seen industrial warfare at its worst. They knew what it did to human beings. They were determined to prevent it from happening again. Others drew different conclusions. They believed Verdun proved that nations must be strong, must be prepared, must never show weakness. Otherwise, enemies would attack, and the suffering would be even worse. This division, between those who concluded never again and those who concluded never again unprepared, would shape European politics for decades. The questions raised by Verdun had no easy answers. Could Germany have won if Falkenhayn had executed the offensive differently? Probably. If he had committed more infantry in the first week, the Meuse heights would likely have fallen. Should France have defended Verdun? Militarily, it was debatable. Politically and psychologically, France had no choice once the battle began. Was it worth it? 712,000 casualties for a battle that ended with the lines roughly where they'd started. The answer depends on how you measure worth. In military terms, probably not. In terms of national will and symbolism, perhaps yes. But the men who died at Verdun didn't get to decide if their sacrifice was worth it. Today, more than a century later, the battlefield of Verdun remains a vast memorial. The Douaumont ossuary, contains the remains of 130,000 unidentified soldiers. French and German bones mixed together. Nobody knows which bones belong to which nation anymore. They died as enemies. They rest together as anonymous dead. Perhaps that's the only victory Verdun offers. In death, the divisions that seemed so important in life become meaningless. Visitors to Verdun today can walk the battlefield. Shell craters are still visible everywhere. In some areas, so densely packed that the ground looks like the surface of the moon. The landscape has been partly reclaimed by nature. Trees grow where forests were destroyed. Grass covers the old trenches. But look closely, and you can still see the scars. Parts of the Zone Rouge remain off-limits. Warning signs tell visitors not to leave marked paths. The danger from unexploded ordnance is still real. Every year, farmers and construction workers find shells. Every few years, someone is killed or injured when old ordnance explodes. The battle is still claiming casualties over a century later. The soil in some areas remains too toxic for agriculture. Tests show dangerous concentrations of heavy metals, arsenic, and other toxins. Engineers estimate full remediation would take centuries more. Verdun's longest-lasting effect may be symbolic. The battle became the defining image of World War I. When people think about the Western Front, they often picture Verdun. The endless bombardment, the mud and corpses, the grinding, pointless attrition. Literature and film return to Verdun again and again. The battle provides the archetype for meaningless industrial slaughter. This symbolism isn't entirely fair to the historical reality. Many other battles in World War I were equally terrible. The Somme killed more men. Passchendaele was equally horrific. But Verdun captured something essential: the futility, the impossibility of either side winning or losing, the sense of being trapped in a machine that consumed men for no clear purpose. In the end, Erich von Falkenhayn's gamble at Verdun was fatal, not because his military plan was bad, though it was flawed, but because he had no real plan at all. He hoped that attacking Verdun would somehow shift the strategic balance, that France would break or collapse or seek peace, that a stroke of good luck would bring an advantageous solution. Hope isn't strategy. France gambled 377,000 men. Germany gambled 335,000. Neither side won anything worth that price. This is the lesson of Verdun, if there is a lesson. Not tactics or strategy or operational art, but a question that echoes across the century. What are we willing to sacrifice? And for what?